He arrived with 2 shirts, a borrowed suitcase, and a number written on a folded piece of paper. The number wasn't a bank balance. It was a phone number. The only person he knew in a country that didn't know him. The airport felt too large, too bright, too fast. Announcements echoed in a language he understood but didn't yet belong to. People moved with purpose. He moved with uncertainty. He had $73 in his pocket. Not 73,000, 73. Back home, that money had been collected from relatives who believed in hope more than probability. They didn't invest in his skills. They invested in the idea that somewhere else, effort might matter more than background. He wasn't escaping poverty. He was escaping predictability. The first job he took wasn't glamorous. It was night shift warehouse labor. Lifting, sorting, stacking. 12 hours of repetition. Hands cracked, back stiff, pride silent. But every night during his 15-minute break, he read. Not novels, financial statements. He printed free annual reports from the public library, highlighted words he didn't understand, Googled terms after shift ended. He didn't chase motivational quotes, he chased patterns. He noticed something strange. The companies that survived recessions weren't always the biggest. They were the least fragile. Low debt, high liquidity, boring industries, predictable cash flow. Meanwhile, companies praised on television for aggressive expansion often collapsed when credit tightened. He didn't have capital, but he had observation, and observation costs nothing. After 8 months, he saved $4,200, not from brilliance, from discipline. Shared apartment, no car, minimal expenses, no new clothes, no entertainment. His coworkers laughed gently when he declined weekend outings. "You work too much," they said. He smiled. He wasn't working, he was preparing. His first investment wasn't a stock tip or a trendy startup. It was a small position in a neglected manufacturing firm everyone ignored. Low media coverage, low hype, stable revenue, minimal debt. When it dipped slightly due to market panic, he bought more. He didn't feel fear, he felt confirmation. 2 years later, that boring company quietly doubled in value while flashy tech startups imploded. He didn't celebrate publicly, he reinvested. His strategy evolved slowly. He searched for immigrants like him, owners of small businesses with strong work ethic but weak financial structure. Restaurants with loyal customers but poor capital planning, supply companies with contracts but expensive short-term loans. He offered something unusual, not charity, structure. He would invest modestly in exchange for partial ownership and financial oversight, reduce unnecessary leverage, introduce cash reserves, build discipline. Some accepted, some didn't trust him. Trust is harder to earn when you speak with an accent, but results speak louder than background. Within 5 years, he controlled minority stakes in 6 small businesses, none glamorous, all stable. When a regional downturn hit, 3 competitors around them collapsed. His companies survived, not because they were lucky, because they had buffers. That's when local investors began noticing him. "Where did you learn this?" one asked. He shrugged. "I watched who failed." Failure was his teacher. Poverty was his training ground. Isolation was his focus. Then opportunity arrived, disguised as a crisis. A mid-sized distribution company, founded by another immigrant decades earlier, faced bankruptcy due to aggressive expansion financed with floating-rate debt. Revenue strong, structure broken. Banks were unwilling to renegotiate. He didn't have enough capital alone, but he had something more valuable: credibility among small business owners he had helped. He gathered them, proposed a collective investment vehicle, pooling disciplined capital, no excessive leverage, strict liquidity rules, shared governance. It wasn't flashy, it was precise. They agreed. The acquisition shocked local markets. A group of immigrants restructuring a mid-sized firm without institutional backing? Media barely covered it, but inside financial circles, eyebrows lifted. He restructured debt into fixed long-term obligations, sold non-essential assets, focused on profitable routes, eliminated ego-driven expansion. Within 3 years, profitability stabilized. Within 5, the company became a regional backbone. He didn't become rich overnight. He became respected slowly, and respect compounds. Investors approached him now, not to control him, to join him. He refused capital that demanded aggressive growth, accepted only aligned money. That discipline rewrote his trajectory, because while others scaled recklessly, he scaled structurally. By the 10th year, he wasn't just investing, he was building systems. Supply chain integration between owned firms, shared procurement agreements reducing costs, centralized financial oversight. He wasn't building a company, he was building an ecosystem. And ecosystems survive storms better than isolated giants. The turning point came during a national recession. Credit markets froze, banks tightened lending, panic spread. Companies over-leveraged for expansion began collapsing rapidly. He moved calmly, liquidity reserves deployed strategically, acquired distressed assets at rational valuations, integrated them into his growing network. For the first time, major financial publications noticed. Immigrant-led investment group expands during recession. The headline was small, but symbolic. He had crossed a threshold, not from poor to rich, from invisible to undeniable. At a conference years later, a wealthy executive asked him bluntly, "What's your advantage?" He answered quietly, "I remember what it feels like to have nothing." The room fell silent, because that memory prevented recklessness, it prevented ego, it prevented fragility. He wasn't driven by greed, he was driven by insulation. He understood that when you grow up unstable, you crave structure more than applause, and structure is rare in markets addicted to growth. By the 15th year, he managed assets larger than he once imagined possible. But he still reviewed liquidity ratios personally, still questioned leverage assumptions, still asked executives one critical question: what breaks first under stress? Most leaders ask how to grow. He asked how to survive. And survival, compounded over decades, becomes dominance. He didn't rewrite financial history with noise. He rewrote it with discipline. By proving that resilience, not aggression, creates generational impact. By showing that immigrants don't just seek opportunity, sometimes they redesign it. And the boy who arrived with $73 and a folded phone number became the architect of a financial philosophy that outlasted cycles, headlines, and doubters. But the real test was still ahead. Because building wealth is one challenge, defending it under scrutiny is another. And when influence grows quietly, power begins to notice. He did not celebrate when the first major headline mentioned his name. The article called him the quiet architect behind a new financial order. It praised his discipline, his patience, his unusual ability to see value where others saw weakness. But he folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside as if it were just another document to file away. Because he knew something the journalists did not. The story was not about him. It was about access. It was about what happens when someone who once had none decides to build systems so others never feel that same invisible wall again. By the time part 2 of his life began, he was no longer poor, he was no longer unknown, but in his mind, he was still the boy standing on a dock in a new country, clutching a single suitcase and a paper with an address written in careful handwriting. And that memory guided every decision. After the crisis years, when markets had collapsed and fear ruled the air like smoke after a fire, he had stepped in quietly and acquired positions others abandoned. He did not speculate wildly. He did not chase headlines. He purchased durable things, cash flow, infrastructure, land tied to necessity, companies that produced goods people could not stop buying even in panic. Utilities, transportation routes, essential manufacturing, payment systems. He believed in the unglamorous backbone of an economy. When growth returned, his holdings rose not dramatically, but steadily, and steady growth compounded. That word, compounded, was his favorite. It meant time working as an ally. It meant patience rewarded. It meant discipline beating impulse. But success brought a new challenge: influence. Investors began seeking him out. Institutions requested meetings. Policy advisors asked for his opinion. He had become something rare, a man who had survived scarcity, navigated crisis, and built wealth without spectacle. They wanted to know how. He gave the same answer every time. Understand risk before you chase reward. He explained that most people misunderstood leverage. They believed borrowing magnified success, and it did, temporarily, but it also magnified mistakes. In the crisis, he had seen companies collapse not because their ideas were bad, but because their debt was built on optimism rather than resilience. So he structured his empire differently. He used leverage carefully, attached to assets that produced predictable cash flow. He insisted on liquidity reserves that could sustain downturns. He diversified across sectors tied to necessity, not trend. It was not glamorous, it was durable, and durability rewrote financial history far more often than boldness did. One evening, he visited the old neighborhood where he had first rented a small room decades earlier. The grocery store was gone. The narrow apartment building had been renovated, but the sidewalk was the same cracked concrete. He stood there quietly. He remembered the humiliation of being told he did not qualify for a loan because he had no credit history. He remembered being turned away from partnerships because he lacked pedigree. He remembered being underestimated because of his accent. He had not responded with anger. He had responded with structure. He built his own credit through small, disciplined transactions. He partnered with those who valued reliability over image. He allowed performance to speak before he did. And now, instead of asking banks for access, banks asked him for capital. But part 2 was not about revenge, it was about reform. He began funding financial education programs in immigrant communities, not flashy charity events, practical workshops, budgeting, compound interest, business incorporation, credit building, risk assessment. He remembered the first time he understood the power of compounding. A mentor had drawn a simple graph on scrap paper. A small amount invested consistently grew slowly at first, then faster, then almost unbelievably over decades. That curve had changed his life, so he gave that curve to others. He invested in community banks that focused on first-time entrepreneurs. He structured microloans with mentorship requirements attached. He believed capital without guidance could be dangerous, but capital with education could transform families, and it did. A grocery store owner expanded into distribution. A mechanic opened a second location. A software developer launched a startup that later employed hundreds. He watched quietly as generational wealth began to form in neighborhoods once defined by scarcity. He was not rewriting financial history through headlines. He was rewriting it through access. At industry conferences, he was often asked about his edge. What secret insight allowed him to move differently during crisis? What formula did he use to identify undervalued assets? He would pause before answering. "My edge," he would say, "was fear." The audience would laugh, assuming humility or irony. But he meant it literally. He understood fear intimately. He had lived with it. Fear of eviction, fear of unemployment, fear of invisibility. So when markets panicked, he recognized the emotion instantly. He could separate structural failure from emotional overreaction. Where others saw catastrophe, he asked a simpler question: has human behavior permanently changed? If people still needed electricity, utilities were safe. If families still needed food, agriculture would survive. If businesses still needed to move money, payment systems would endure. He believed in behavior, not in narratives. That philosophy guided his expansion into international markets. When emerging economies faced temporary instability, he analyzed demographic trends rather than headlines. Young populations, rising urbanization, growing middle classes, these were signals stronger than fear. He partnered locally. He respected cultural nuance. He never entered a market assuming superiority. He entered assuming learning. That humility protected him. Years passed. His wealth multiplied, not explosively, but persistently. He refused to overextend in boom times. He refused to retreat in downturns. He built buffers into every layer of his structure. And gradually, financial institutions began modeling risk differently because of him. They studied his portfolio allocations. They analyzed his liquidity ratios. They noticed his consistent performance through cycles. Risk management frameworks shifted. Reserve requirements increased. Diversification standards strengthened. Liquidity became a central conversation rather than an afterthought. He never demanded these changes. He simply demonstrated them. One day, a young analyst approached him after a conference. The analyst had recently immigrated. He spoke with the same cautious determination the man once carried. "How did you stop feeling like an outsider?" the analyst asked. He considered the question carefully. "You don't. You redefine what the room values." He explained that when he first entered boardrooms, he felt judged. His accent was different, his education unconventional, his network limited. So he shifted the criteria. Instead of trying to sound like everyone else, he became the most prepared person in the room. Instead of relying on charm, he relied on clarity. Instead of competing for attention, he competed for accuracy. Over time, results changed perception, and perception changed opportunity. Part 2 of his life was not about accumulating more wealth. It was about stabilizing the wealth he had built and ensuring it could not be destroyed by ego or excess. He created succession plans long before he needed them. He diversified leadership. He embedded governance structures that prevented reckless expansion. He remembered too clearly how quickly everything could disappear. During a later market correction, smaller than the crisis that defined him, but still significant, many aggressive firms faltered. Over-leveraged positions unraveled. Speculative assets plunged. His companies remained steady. Because he had not built them on optimism, he had built them on probability. The media called it foresight. He called it memory. He remembered what it felt like to lose everything.
and he structured his empire so that losing everything would be nearly impossible. But perhaps the most profound shift occurred quietly within him. He stopped measuring success by net worth. He began measuring it by resilience. When one of his portfolio companies faced unexpected regulatory challenges, he did not panic. He deployed legal expertise, compliance teams, contingency capital. He treated setbacks as engineering problems, not personal failures. That mindset rippled outward. Entrepreneurs he mentored adopted similar frameworks. Instead of chasing rapid growth at all costs, they focused on sustainable margins. Instead of maximizing short-term value.
The invitation arrived without ceremony. A plain envelope, a simple request, a closed-door meeting with policymakers, central bank advisors, and institutional leaders who were quietly worried about something most citizens could not yet see. The economy was strong on the surface. Markets were optimistic. Credit was expanding rapidly. New financial products were emerging faster than regulators could understand them. It felt familiar. Too familiar. He sat at the long table, surrounded by people who controlled enormous levers of power. Decades earlier, he would have been intimidated. Now, he felt something different. Concern. Not for himself, for the system. Because he recognized the pattern, confidence drifting into complacency, innovation drifting into excess, leverage drifting into fragility. When it was his turn to speak, he did not begin with numbers. He began with a story. "I once watched a man build a beautiful house on sand," he said. "It looked impressive, it attracted attention, but when the tide rose, it did not matter how beautiful it was." The room went quiet. He explained that rapid financial innovation was not the problem. Innovation was necessary. Growth was necessary. But complexity without transparency was dangerous. Debt layered upon debt created illusions of safety. Risk redistributed did not mean risk disappeared. He had seen this before. He had survived it. And he did not want to watch another generation relive it. Some in the room resisted. They argued that stricter safeguards would slow growth, that markets were smarter now, that technology reduced systemic risk. He listened patiently. Then he asked a simple question. If growth depends on fragility, is it truly growth? Silence again, because everyone in that room understood what he meant. Over the next months, he worked behind the scenes, not as a critic, but as a collaborator. He helped design stress testing frameworks for large institutions. He advocated for clearer liquidity standards. He supported transparency rules for complex derivatives. He did not seek public credit. He sought durability. Financial history would later note that the reforms implemented during that period prevented cascading failures during the next global downturn. Losses occurred, yes. Markets fell, yes. But collapse did not. Banks did not freeze entirely. Credit did not evaporate completely. Panic did not metastasize into systemic paralysis. The tide rose, but the foundation held. And very few people knew how much of that resilience traced back to a poor immigrant who once counted coins to afford dinner. Yet Part 3 was not about policy, it was about legacy. As his influence expanded, so did his wealth, not just in numbers, but in responsibility. His portfolio spanned continents. His decisions affected thousands of employees, millions of customers, entire regional economies. He began asking himself a question that unsettled him. What happens when I am no longer here? He had built structure in business. Now he needed structure in succession. He gathered his leadership teams and did something unusual. He invited disagreement. He asked younger executives to challenge his strategies. He encouraged alternative risk models. He created internal failure simulations where teams stress-tested not only assets but leadership assumptions. He believed stagnation began when success became unquestioned. By institutionalizing challenge, he protected the system from himself.
At home, he spoke with his children, not about inheritance, but about stewardship. He told them wealth was not a trophy, it was infrastructure. It required maintenance, humility, and perspective. He did not promise them control, he promised them education. Each of them worked outside the family empire before entering it. Each of them faced failure without his protection. Each of them earned credibility independently. Because he understood something many wealthy founders did not. Unprepared heirs can destroy in one generation what discipline built in 3. Meanwhile, the communities he had invested in decades earlier began transforming in visible ways. Immigrant neighborhoods that once struggled with predatory lending now housed community-owned financial cooperatives. Entrepreneurs who had attended his early workshops were now mentors themselves. Families who once rented cramped apartments owned homes, funded college educations, and launched business. Generational wealth had taken root, and it was not dependent on him. That realization gave him more satisfaction than any valuation milestone ever had. One evening, he returned again to the dock where he first arrived. It was different now, modernized, expanded, bustling with global trade. But the water moved the same way. The air carried the same quiet promise. He stood there without security, without announcement, just a man remembering. He thought about the first job he worked, the humiliation of rejection, the exhaustion of night shifts, the first small investment, the first failure, the crisis that nearly erased everything, the discipline that saved it. He realized something profound. He had not rewritten financial history by being the smartest. He had rewritten it by being the most consistent. Consistency in saving when income was small. Consistency in learning when others dismissed him. Consistency in restraint when markets tempted excess. Consistency in courage when fear dominated. Financial systems, like lives, are shaped not by dramatic moments alone, but by repeated disciplined decisions over time. As years passed, his public appearances became rarer. He shifted from operator to advisor, from builder to guardian. But his principles remained embedded in institutions, in communities, in families. During one final address, smaller than the grand conferences of earlier years, he was asked what single idea changed his life the most. He smiled. Ownership, he said. Not ownership of luxury, ownership of responsibility, ownership of knowledge, ownership of risk. He explained that poverty often removes a sense of control. It convinces people they're passengers in systems too large to influence. His life proved otherwise. An immigrant who arrived with nothing had learned the rules, respected the risks, built patiently, protected relentlessly, and reinvested wisely. He did not chase history, he studied it. He did not attack the system, he strengthened it. And by doing so, he ensured that when storms came, as they always do, the damage would be smaller, the recovery faster, the future more secure. Long after his name faded from the headlines, his structures endured. Banks that survived downturns, companies that prioritized resilience over hype, families who understood compounding, communities with access to capital and education. That was the true rewriting of financial history. Not a single transaction, not a single acquisition, not a single headline, but a shift in philosophy. From fragility to foundation, from speculation to structure, from exclusion to access. And it all began with a poor immigrant stepping onto foreign soil, carrying nothing but determination and a willingness to learn the rules of a game he was never expected to win. In the end, history did not remember him as poor. It remembered him as prepared. And that made all the difference.